My function here is twofold. The first is I'm supposed to deliver some provocations about diversifying participation for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to our real speaker this evening, Greg Watkins, and sort of offer a few words of introduction. On the eve of getting ready to come down here, I found myself rereading a number of works by John Fiske, who was my mentor in graduate school. And this is a year where Fiske's contribution to the field is being commemorated by a conference in Madison and a reissue of his books. And I was reading it with a growing sense of strangeness, because Fiske was writing in the late 80s, early 90s, and he talked a lot about the art of making do. And the language of that time was one of resistance, that is, knowing that we do not control the means of cultural production and distribution, how do people carve out a space for themselves, for their cultural identities in relation to the technological environment that surrounds them. And as I was reading through this, I finally got to his last book, Media Matters, which is written it comes out just early in the Clinton administration years. And there's a kind of just beginning to see the emergence of a possibility that, in fact, we don't just take from the existing culture and remix it, but that we actually are able to create and circulate our own stuff. And so I want to pose that notion of the art of making do against where we are now, where we are increasingly part of what I call a participatory culture. We have transformed the tools of cultural production and distribution so that many more people than ever before are able to create things and share things with each other. We all know the numbers the Pew Center has produced year after year, showing gradual increases, but significant increases, in our ability to participate. What the MacArthur work has done, I think, has demonstrated that that participatory culture is a valuable environmental ecosystem. And it's true whether we talk about it as digital media and learning, whether we talk about it as affinity spaces, whether we talk about it as I do participatory culture. There are things going on there that are very powerful and reinforce learning that enable people to grow in distinctive ways. And that means it's a powerful resource in school and out that we really want to be concerned with. Increasingly, I hear the word participatory culture get collapsed in with Web 2.0, right? And I don't want to guard, I vigilantly try to guard against the blurring of those two things, that Web 2.0 is a business model. It describes a particular way of capital around the distribution of culture. Those tools that are called Web 2.0 tools play a very important role in enabling us to share media and form social networks. But to collapse the two together is to ignore a history that is much older than the history of the web. So increasingly, I've been asking people to go back to Web -10, right, to talk about that history, which is, Web -10 for me was a period in the 1850s, 1860s, the beginnings of the Amateur Press Association in the United States. So something Paula Petrick has written about, some very interesting things. That high school age kids were taking a toy printing presses and laying out type and printing out zines which circulated across the country. And they formed virtual communities or social networks with each other to share and exchange those ideas. Now, I keep thinking about my characters on Twitter and 155 characters and how long it would take to set 155 pieces of type, letter by letter, just to print out the tweet that I put out this morning. But the power of these young people to form this network. What's fascinating is that they immediately turned it to both participation in popular culture and to civic participation. They were discussing popular stories and they were discussing the issues of the day. And the space turns out to be contested but diverse, which is to say that Paula Petrick's account describes African-American editors who fought to be included in the Amateur Press Association and were ultimately one space in the 1860s to be part of that, and talks about female editors struggling to be accepted but gaining acceptance in the Amateur Press Association of the 1860s. So there was a struggle there around this technology to allow diverse participation to take place and to enable a community to grow. Now, of course, this is written out of the history of communications. As have successive generations, we can trace an almost unbroken chain of participatory culture embracing new technologies, incorporating into its practices, and fighting over issues of diversity from that period to the present. The fascinating thing is, because they had to set the type by hand, they used abbreviations, and one of the abbreviations was LOL. Laugh out loud. So in fact, we think of that as the marking the digital generation, but it actually goes back to about 1860. So that history of the participation, I think, is a vital one for us to keep in mind, because it reminds us of a struggle that's gone on to ensure diversity and participation and to enable the democratization of communication in this country. And it's one that we have to pay attention to. Now, often when we talk about the challenge over the last two decades, the challenge has been framed in terms of a digital divide. And the digital divide is about information haves and have-nots, and it's mostly got framed in terms of access to technology. And in my own work, I push beyond that to think about the participation gap, which is about access to social skills, cultural competencies, cultural capital, social networks, time, all of the things that block us from being able to fully, blocks people from being able to fully participate in this new participatory culture. And those of us who believe in the value of participatory culture have to be concerned with those blockages. But it's also increasingly clear that we can't just sum this up as a binary, that either you're in the digital or you're out of the digital. There's, in fact, diverse forms of participation and diverse forms of blockages. There are multiple insides and there are multiple outsides. And I'm hoping that as we deal with the issues this weekend, we can explore those ways that people are allowed in and still may be marginalized. There are messages may be decontextualized. They may be, user moderation may allow the best to rise to the top, and the best turns out to be white male content, and the rest of it gets filtered out. We should be concerned with the sort of digital enclaves that Cass Sunstein talks about, but also the gated communities that Craig Watkins and Dana Boyd have talked about. But these are issues that we have to have front and center as we think about how we ensure diversity of participation. I'm interested increasingly in circulation as well as production, and the question of how messages go awry, how messages get blocked, how messages get reinterpreted and decontextualized in this new environment seems really crucial to that. So I'll begin by talking about Fisk, and Fisk in that final essay he wrote for Media Matters talked about the Rodney King tape, right? And he describes this as a moment where the population has access to tools and cameras of counter-surveillance in which they can record the police, and those messages have high authenticity and high credibility because they're so primitive in their technological capacity. And then he describes the way those messages get picked up by the defense at the Rodney King trial and recontextualized, reworked, transformed high-tech. And so he talked about high-tech and low-tech. He talked about the two as different levels of credibility, as a techno-struggle that we would increasingly face as we move forward between different layers of cultural production and who's included, who's excluded in that. And Fisk, who's often accused of being a blind optimist, a naive optimist, ends that essay with the statement that we now have new opportunities to struggle. And I find that a really telling phrase, new opportunities to struggle for participation, for access to ideas, for the democratization of society. That Fisk, at that moment, doesn't describe utopia, doesn't describe, as we've seen increasingly digital rhetoric sort of suggest that the technology gives us things on the silver platter. He says we have new opportunities to struggle. And I think this weekend we are here to struggle. We're here to ask questions. And when we set up this paper call, we had several things in mind. One was that we would broaden the network around MacArthur by bringing in voices and perspectives that we didn't necessarily hear already, and that we would hear about projects that didn't necessarily look like what we would see. Another was we wanted to challenge people to move from very general constructs of the reader, the user, the learner, that often sort of stripped away cultural particularity and insist on getting to very particular case studies and very particular accounts of diverse cultures of learning and cultural production. And we wanted to challenge the established leaders of this field to question and drill down on their own practices to see what roles diversity and participation played in their work, and how we can all be dedicated to work that much harder to ensure the diversification of the digital space. I think the proposals we got in match that challenge. I think people here have come here ready to engage in that conversation. So let us seize this opportunity for struggle and think about the future together of where digital technology can go.